Most people think submarine warfare was just about sinking ships and disappearing into the depths. But on June 4th, 1944, one German U-boat broke every rule of naval combat, and what happened next changed the course of World War II in ways nobody saw coming. The Atlantic Ocean in 1944 was a graveyard. Thousands of ships lay scattered across the ocean floor, victims of a brutal campaign that had been raging for nearly 5 years. The Germans called it the Battle of the Atlantic, and for good reason. It was the longest continuous military campaign of the entire war, stretching from the first day of fighting in September 1939 to the very last moments in May 1945. But by the spring of 1944, something had shifted. The hunters were becoming the hunted. Submarine U-505 was not supposed to be in the Atlantic that day. In fact, by all reasonable assessments, she should have been scrapped or sent back to port for extended repairs. This Type 9C U-boat had been plagued by problems since her first patrol. Her crew whispered about a curse. Some called her a coffin with a propeller, and they had good reason to think so. The boat had launched from Lorient, France, on what would be her 12th and final patrol. Her commander, Oberleutnant Harold Lang, was relatively inexperienced for someone leading a U-boat into the deadliest waters on Earth. The original commander, Peter Zek, had committed suicide aboard the vessel during a depth-charge attack just months earlier. That incident alone would have been enough to destroy morale on any ship. But U-505 had seen worse. She'd been bombed, depth-charged, damaged by her own malfunctioning equipment, and had gone through commanders like other boats went through torpedoes. The crew of 59 men knew the odds. By 1944, being assigned to a U-boat was essentially a death sentence. The Kriegsmarine had lost hundreds of submarines in the previous year alone. New detection technologies, improved anti-submarine tactics, and the sheer overwhelming force of Allied naval power had turned the tables completely. Where once the U-boats had roamed freely, picking off merchant ships like wolves among sheep, now they were the prey. But numbers and statistics meant nothing to the men crammed into that steel tube beneath the waves. They had jobs to do, stations to man, and a war to fight. On the morning of June 4th, U-505 was cruising at periscope depth, about 150 miles off the coast of West Africa, near the Cape Verde Islands. The location was not random. German naval intelligence had identified this area as a potential hunting ground, where Allied convoys might be more vulnerable, further from air cover and escort groups. What the Germans did not know was that the Americans had been hunting U-505 specifically. Not just any submarine, but this particular boat. And the man leading that hunt was one of the most aggressive and innovative anti-submarine commanders in the United States Navy. Captain Daniel Gallery was not your typical naval officer. He was brash, confident to the point of arrogance, and absolutely obsessed with an idea that most people in the Navy thought was insane. He wanted to capture a U-boat. Not sink one, not damage one, but capture one intact and bring it back to the United States. His superiors thought he was crazy. Capturing an enemy submarine in the middle of combat was considered practically impossible. Submarines were designed to sink when severely damaged, and German crews were trained to scuttle their boats rather than let them fall into enemy hands. The chances of success were astronomically low, But Gallery had a plan, and more importantly, he had the right ship for the job. The USS Guadalcanal was an escort carrier, a smaller version of the massive fleet carriers that dominated headlines in the Pacific. Escort carriers were designed for one purpose: hunting submarines. They carried a small group of aircraft and were accompanied by a task group of destroyer escorts. Gallery's task group, known as Task Group 22.3, consisted of the Guadalcanal and 5 destroyer escorts: Pillsbury, Pope, Flaherty, Chatelain, and Jenks. Together they formed a highly coordinated submarine hunting pack. Gallery had drilled his men relentlessly on boarding procedures. He had assembled a special team trained to rush onto a submarine if the opportunity ever presented itself. Most importantly, he had impressed upon his officers that if they ever had a chance to capture rather than sink a U-boat, they should take it, no matter how dangerous it seemed. The Navy brass had humored him, probably figuring the opportunity would never arise. They were about to be proven spectacularly wrong. On June 4th, the weather was clear, the sea relatively calm. The Guadalcanal's aircraft were flying routine patrols, searching for any sign of submarine activity. At approximately 11:09 in the morning, one of the Wildcat fighters spotted something. A faint disturbance in the water, almost imperceptible but there. The pilot circled back, looking more carefully. Then he saw it clearly: the dark shadow of a submarine, just below the surface. The pilot immediately radioed the contact to the Guadalcanal. Within minutes, the entire task group was converging on the location. Gallery's careful planning was about to be put to the ultimate test. The destroyer escort, USS Chatelain, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Dudley Knox, was the closest vessel. Knox pushed his ship to flank speed, racing toward the contact coordinates. Aboard U-505, the crew had no idea death was about to rain down from above. They were conducting a routine battery charge, running on diesel engines while at periscope depth, to replenish the electrical power needed for underwater operations. The boat was vulnerable in this state, unable to quickly dive to safety. When the lookouts finally spotted the aircraft, it was already too late. The Americans attacked with textbook precision. Aircraft dropped depth charges and fired machine guns at the submarine's conning tower, forcing her to remain on the surface. The Chatelain arrived at full speed and immediately fired a pattern of hedgehog projectiles. These were a relatively new weapon, small contact-fused bombs that were thrown forward from the ship in a circular pattern. Unlike depth charges, which exploded at a preset depth, whether they hit anything or not, hedgehogs only detonated on direct impact. 3 of the hedgehogs slammed into U-505's hull near the bow. The explosions were catastrophic. Water began flooding into the forward compartments. Electrical systems sparked and failed. The boat's trim went completely wrong, and she began to sink by the bow. In the control room, chaos erupted. Damage reports were screaming in from every section. The chief engineer was shouting about flooding that could not be controlled. Men were scrambling to close watertight doors, to shore up damage, to do anything to save the boat. Oberleutnant Lange made a decision in those crucial seconds. He could try to dive and almost certainly doom his entire crew as the boat sank uncontrollably to the bottom. Or he could surface and scuttle the boat according to protocol, giving his men a chance to survive. He chose his crew over his boat. The order was given to blow ballast and surface. U-505 broke through the waves at 11:22, just 13 minutes after the initial attack. Lange ordered the crew to prepare scuttling charges and abandon ship. In the U-boat service, the procedure was clear. When abandoning a boat, you opened the sea strainers and set demolition charges to ensure the submarine would sink and take all its secrets to the bottom. The crew began the process, but in their panic and the chaos of flooding and damage, mistakes were made. The men poured out of the hatches, jumping into the ocean. Some were injured. Many were terrified, expecting the American ships to machine gun them in the water, as they had heard happened sometimes. They struck out, swimming away from their doomed boat, watching as she began to list to starboard. The scuttling charges had been set. In minutes, U-505 would sink, and with her would go code books, cipher machines, and countless intelligence materials. But Daniel Gallery was watching through his binoculars from the Guadalcanal, and he saw something that made his heart race. The submarine was not sinking fast. The crew had abandoned her, but she was still afloat, wallowing in the swells, but not going down. This was his moment. This was the opportunity he had been training for. He grabbed the radio and shouted orders to his task group. "I want a boarding party on that sub immediately." The USS Pillsbury was closest. Her commander, Lieutenant George Castleman, did not hesitate. He brought his ship alongside the drifting U-boat, close enough that the two vessels were almost touching. This was extraordinarily dangerous. If the U-boat suddenly sank or if her scuttling charges detonated, the Pillsbury could be dragged down or heavily damaged. But Castleman held position while Gallery's specially trained boarding party prepared to jump. Lieutenant Albert David led the boarding team. He was the Pillsbury's engineering officer, a man who understood machinery and had volunteered for this duty. With him were 8 other men, all volunteers, all knowing they might be about to board a sinking submarine that could explode at any moment. David did not wait for a gangplank or a ladder. As the Pillsbury rolled in the swells, bringing her deck momentarily level with the submarine's deck, he jumped. He landed on the wet, slippery hull of U-505 and immediately scrambled toward the conning tower hatch. Behind him, his men followed. Some made the jump cleanly. Others slipped and had to be helped up. Petty Officer Arthur Knispel nearly fell into the gap between the two vessels, but was caught by his shipmates. Within seconds, the entire team was on the submarine. The interior of U-505 was a nightmare. Water was sloshing through the forward compartments. Lights flickered and sparked. The air was thick with the smell of diesel fuel, battery acid, and the acrid stench of electrical fires. Emergency lighting cast everything in a hellish red glow, and the boat was making terrible groaning sounds as she settled in the water. But there were no Germans. The crew had completely abandoned her. David and his men immediately began searching for the scuttling charges. They knew the Germans would have set them before leaving. The question was, how much time did they have? Electrician's mate Zenon Lukosius found the charges in the control room, and they were standard German demolition devices, set to detonate with chemical time delay fuses. But in their haste to abandon ship, the German crew had not armed them properly. Either that, or the impacts from the Hedgehog attack had disrupted the firing mechanisms. Whatever the reason, the charges were not going to explode. At least, not immediately. The more immediate problem was the flooding. Water was pouring in through holes blasted in the hull by the Hedgehog attack, and through various valves that the Germans had opened during their scuttling attempt. David sent men running through the boat to find and close every possible opening. It was a race against time and the Atlantic Ocean itself. Meanwhile, on the surface, the other ships in the task group were fishing German sailors out of the water. The prisoners were shocked to see their boat still floating. Several of them became visibly distressed, shouting in German. The Americans did not understand most of it, but the gestures toward the submarine were clear enough. The Germans were trying to warn them that the boat was rigged to explode. Captain Gallery was not about to give up now. He ordered the Guadalcanal to close with the submarine. If his boarding party could not stop the flooding, he would try to take the U-boat under tow. More men were transferred to the submarine, bringing pumps and equipment. The USS Pillsbury actually went alongside U-505 again, using her own pumps to help control the flooding. Aboard the submarine, David and his team were performing miracles. They had found the main sea strainer valve in the engine room, still partially open, gushing water into the bilges. It took 3 men straining with all their strength to close it against the water pressure. In the forward torpedo room, Lucosius and another sailor managed to shore up the damaged areas with wooden beams and mattresses, slowing the flooding to a manageable level. Throughout the boat, men were working in water up to their waists, in darkness, in a vessel that could sink at any moment. But slowly, impossibly, they were winning. The pumps began to gain on the flooding. The boat's list decreased slightly. She was not sinking. U-505 was going to survive. Gallery immediately ordered all sensitive materials to be removed from the submarine. His men began pulling out everything they could find: code books, cipher machines, charts, operational orders, crew lists, technical manuals. They formed a human chain, passing items up through the conning tower hatch and transferring them to the Pillsbury. The intelligence hall was beyond anything the Americans had hoped for. Most valuable of all were the Enigma cipher machines and their associated code books. The Allies had been reading German naval communications for some time, thanks to brilliant code-breaking work by British and Polish mathematicians. But the Germans frequently changed their codes and procedures. Every new code book, every captured machine, gave the codebreakers more information to work with. The materials from U-505 would prove invaluable in the continuing struggle against German submarines. But Gallery had a problem. He had captured a German submarine intact, complete with all her secrets. If word of this got out, the Germans would immediately change all their codes, making the entire intelligence haul worthless. The capture had to be kept absolutely secret. Every man in the task group was sworn to silence on pain of court-martial. The German prisoners were separated and told they were the only survivors, that their submarine had sunk. They were kept in isolation, unable to communicate with other prisoners of war who might spread word of what had happened. The deception worked. For the remainder of the war, German Naval Command assumed that U-505 had been sunk with all hands. They had no idea their submarine was sitting in a closely guarded berth in Bermuda. being studied by American engineers and intelligence officers. The code changes that would have resulted from knowing the capture never happened. The Allies continued to read German naval communications, gaining crucial intelligence on submarine deployments and operations. But getting U-505 to Bermuda was itself an epic story. The submarine was barely seaworthy. She'd been patched and pumped out, but she was not designed to cross open ocean with an inexperienced crew who did not speak German and barely understood her systems. Gallery ordered the submarine to be taken under tow by the USS Abnaki, a fleet tug that had been rushed to the scene. A skeleton crew of volunteers remained aboard U-505 to manage the tow and keep the pumps running. The voyage to Bermuda took several days and was anything but smooth. The weather turned rough. Tow lines broke repeatedly and had to be reconnected, requiring men to go out on the submarine's bucking, wave-swept deck in dangerous conditions. The pumps had to run constantly to keep ahead of leaks. At one point, the submarine began to flood again, and it looked like she might have to be cut loose and allowed to sink. But the crew managed to get the situation under control, and the tow continued. Throughout this entire operation, men were performing acts of incredible courage. Lieutenant David, who had led the initial boarding, was later awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions. It was the only Medal of Honor awarded for action in the Atlantic Theater during World War II. Several other men received Navy Crosses and other decorations. But at the time, none of this could be made public. The men were told their decorations and the reasons for them would remain classified indefinitely. U-505 finally reached Bermuda on June 19th. 15 days after her capture. She was immediately placed under heavy guard in a secure facility where specialists could examine every aspect of her construction and systems. American submarine designers learned a great deal from studying the German boat. Some features of German submarine design were superior to American practice. Others were inferior. All of it was valuable information for the continuing war in the Pacific, where American submarines were conducting their own campaign against Japanese shipping. The intelligence materials recovered from U-505 were rushed to code-breaking centers in Washington and England. The new code books and cipher machine settings filled in gaps in Allied knowledge of German communications procedures. More importantly, the capture provided physical evidence that helped code breakers understand certain quirks in German encryption methods that had been puzzling. The intelligence value of the capture was estimated to have shortened the Battle of the Atlantic by several months, potentially saving hundreds of ships and thousands of lives. As for the German crew, their story was equally remarkable. The 59 men captured from U-505 were the largest group of German prisoners taken in a single naval action up to that point in the war. They were isolated from other prisoners and told repeatedly that their submarine had sunk, that they were the only survivors, and that if they spoke about what had happened, their families in Germany might be endangered. It was a lie, but it worked. None of the prisoners spoke about the capture. The prisoners were held in a special camp in Louisiana, far from other German POWs. They spent the remainder of the war there, working on farms and in other agricultural jobs, completely unaware that their submarine still existed. After the war ended, they were gradually repatriated to Germany. Even then, they were not told the truth about U-505. The submarine's existence remained classified. Oberleutnant Harold Lange, the commander who'd ordered the abandonment of U-505, faced a difficult situation after the war. In German naval tradition, losing your boat was a mark of failure, though in this case, his decision to surface and abandon ship had saved his entire crew. All 59 men survived the war, a remarkable outcome given the casualty rates in the U-boat service. But Lange carried the burden of being the commander who lost U-505, not knowing for years that his boat had not actually sunk. Captain Daniel Gallery became something of a legend in the Navy. His insistence on attempting to capture rather than sink a submarine, which had seemed crazy to his superiors, had paid off spectacularly. The intelligence gained from U-505 was among the most valuable of the entire Battle of the Atlantic. Gallery was promoted and went on to a distinguished career, eventually retiring as a rear admiral. He later wrote several books about his experiences, though he could not discuss the capture of U-505 in detail until the Navy declassified the operation years after the war. The submarine herself had an unexpected afterlife. After the war ended and the intelligence value of keeping her secret had passed, the Navy had to decide what to do with U-505. Some officers wanted to use her as a target for weapons tests. Others thought she should be scrapped. But Gallery had a different idea. He believed the submarine should be preserved as a memorial and a museum piece. After all, she was the only German submarine captured by the United States Navy during the entire war. Gallery began a campaign to save U-505 from the scrapyard. He approached museums and veterans organizations, looking for someone willing to take on the challenge of preserving a submarine. Eventually, the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago agreed to accept the boat. In 1954, nearly 10 years after her capture, U-505 was towed from Portsmouth Naval Shipyard in New Hampshire to Chicago, through the St. Lawrence Seaway and across the Great Lakes. The journey was front-page news across the United States. For the first time, the public learned the full story of U-505's capture. The media coverage was enormous. Millions of people learned about Gallery's daring raid and the incredible courage of the boarding party. The men who had been sworn to secrecy for a decade could finally talk about what they had done. Getting the submarine to her final resting place in Chicago was itself a logistical challenge that bordered on the impossible. U-505 weighed over 500 tons. She had to be towed across Lake Michigan, brought through Chicago's waterways, and then somehow moved overland to the museum, which was located several blocks from the lakeshore. The Navy and the museum spent months planning the operation. On September 2, 1954, U-505 was carefully lifted onto a specially built cradle. Over the next 2 days, using a combination of hydraulic lifts, rollers, and sheer muscle power, the submarine was slowly moved across Lakeshore Drive and onto the grounds of the Museum of Science and Industry. Thousands of Chicagoans lined the streets to watch. It was a spectacle unlike anything the city had seen. The submarine was placed on permanent display outside the museum, where she remained for over 50 years. Millions of visitors toured her cramped interior, trying to imagine what it had been like for 59 men to live and fight in such a confined space. The tour was not for the claustrophobic. Walking through U-505 meant squeezing through narrow passages, ducking through watertight doors, and navigating around pipes and equipment that seemed to occupy every available space. In 2005, the museum undertook a massive project to move U-505 indoors to protect her from the elements. The submarine was carefully disassembled, moved piece by piece into a new underground exhibit hall, and reassembled. Today, she sits in a climate-controlled environment designed to preserve her for future generations. The exhibit tells the full story of her capture, the intelligence coup it represented, and the broader context of the Battle of the Atlantic. But beyond the hardware and the history, U-505 represents something more. She is a reminder of the incredible courage required of submarine crews on both sides of the conflict. The men who served aboard her faced death every time they dove beneath the waves. They lived in conditions that were barely habitable, breathing recycled air, eating preserved food, never seeing sunlight, never knowing if the next depth charge would be the one that crushed their hull and sent them to the bottom. The German U-boat service suffered one of the highest casualty rates of any military unit in history. Of the approximately 40,000 men who served in U-boats during World War II, roughly 30,000 were killed. That is a loss rate of 75%. 3 out of every 4 men who went to sea in a U-boat did not come home. The crews knew these odds, and they went anyway. That takes a special kind of courage, regardless of what side of the war they fought on. Similarly, the Allied sailors who hunted the U-boats faced their own terrors. Merchant seamen on convoy duty knew that a torpedo could strike at any moment, often without warning. Men on escort vessels spent weeks at sea in brutal weather, constantly searching, constantly alert, knowing that the enemy was out there somewhere in the darkness. The Battle of the Atlantic was a war of nerves as much as weapons. The capture of U-505 also highlighted the importance of intelligence in modern warfare. The code books and cipher materials taken from the submarine contributed to the Allied ability to read German communications. This intelligence allowed convoy routes to be adjusted to avoid known U-boat concentrations. It enabled anti-submarine forces to be positioned where they would be most effective. It helped Allied planners understand German strategy and tactics. In a war where information could mean the difference between life and death for thousands of people, the capture of U-505 was priceless. The story has one final poignant chapter. In the 1990s, after the reunification of Germany, several of the surviving crew members of U-505 were invited to Chicago to see their old boat. They had not seen her since June 4th, 1944, when they jumped into the Atlantic Ocean expecting never to see her again. Now 50 years later, they were walking through her again, old men revisiting the place where they had been young and terrified and far from home. The visit was emotional for everyone involved. The German veterans walked through the submarine, pointing out their old duty stations, telling stories about life aboard the boat. They met with some of the American sailors who had captured U-505, men they had viewed as enemies half a century earlier. The former enemies shook hands, shared memories, and acknowledged the common bond of having been to war. Whatever political causes they had fought for, they all understood the reality of naval combat, the fear and the courage required. One of the German veterans, on being asked how he felt, seeing the boat again, said something remarkable. He said he was grateful. Grateful that U-505 had survived when so many boats and so many crews had not. Grateful that she served now as a memorial to all the men on both sides who had fought and died in the Battle of the Atlantic. Grateful that young people could visit her and try to understand what that war had been like. The Battle of the Atlantic was, in many ways, the most important campaign of World War II. Control of the Atlantic shipping lanes determined whether Britain could survive, whether Allied armies could be supplied and reinforced, whether the invasion of Europe could take place. The U-boats came perilously close to cutting those lifelines. In the dark days of 1942 and early 1943, German submarines were sinking Allied ships faster than they could be replaced. Winston Churchill later wrote that the U-boat peril was the only thing that ever truly frightened him during the entire war. But the Allies adapted. New technologies like radar and sonar improved detection capabilities. Long-range aircraft closed the Atlantic air gap, where U-boats had previously operated with relative impunity. Code breaking provided crucial intelligence. Convoy tactics improved. And men like Daniel Gallery developed aggressive new strategies for hunting and killing submarines. By mid-1943, the tide had turned. U-boats were being sunk faster than Germany could build replacements. The Battle of the Atlantic was won, though the fighting would continue until the end of the war. U-505 was captured right in the middle of this turning point. June 1944 was the month of the D-Day invasion. Allied forces were landing in Normandy, beginning the liberation of Europe. The success of that invasion depended absolutely on controlling the Atlantic, ensuring that troops and supplies could flow from America to Europe without being interdicted by U-boats. Every submarine removed from the battle, every piece of intelligence gained, contributed to that success. The submarine sits today in Chicago as a testament to that struggle. She is one of only a handful of German U-boats that survived the war intact. Most were scuttled by their crews in the final days of the conflict. Some were taken by the Allies and used for target practice or research. A few were preserved as memorials. U-505 is the only one in the United States, and one of only 4 Type 9 U-boats remaining anywhere in the world. Walking through her today, you can see the tiny bunks where men slept in shifts. Never all at the same time because there were not enough beds. You can see the galley where meals were prepared for 59 men using equipment that would not look out of place in a food truck. You can see the torpedo rooms where 1,500-pound weapons were loaded, aimed, and fired by crews working in spaces barely large enough to move around in. You can see the diesel engines that provided power on the surface and the massive battery banks that powered the submarine underwater. You can see the periscopes, the radio room, the navigation station, the commander's tiny cabin. But more than the hardware, you can sense the claustrophobia, the oppressive closeness of everything. Modern submarines are spacious palaces compared to U-505. This was a boat where men could not stand up straight in most compartments, where privacy was non-existent, where the air was always stale and stinking of diesel fuel and unwashed bodies. Living conditions were primitive. The toilet could only be used when the boat was on the surface or at shallow depths. At depth, the pressure made the system unusable. Crews sometimes went days without being able to properly relieve themselves. And these men lived like this for weeks on end, through storms that tossed the boat around like a toy, through depth charge attacks that shook everything and everyone, through the constant fear that the next time they went down, they might not come back up. The psychological strain was enormous. U-boat crews had higher rates of psychological problems than almost any other military unit. Some men could not handle it and had to be invalided out of service. Others coped by becoming fatalistic, accepting that they were probably going to die and making peace with it. And some, like Commander Zhek on U-505's 11th patrol, broke completely under the strain. The museum exhibit around U-505 does an excellent job of contextualizing her story within the larger Battle of the Atlantic. Displays show the tonnage of Allied shipping sunk by month, the number of U-boats lost, the technological developments on both sides. There are artifacts from the crew, photographs, letters, personal items. There are detailed explanations of how the capture was carried out, with testimony from both the American boarding party and the German crew. There is discussion of the intelligence value of the capture and how it contributed to Allied victory. Educational programs at the museum use U-505 to teach about World War II, about technology, about courage and sacrifice, about the human cost of war. School groups tour the submarine regularly, and for many young people, it is their first real encounter with the reality of what war means. It is one thing to read about submarine warfare in a book or see it in a movie. It is quite another to physically stand inside a submarine and realize just how vulnerable and exposed the crew was. The capture of U-505 demonstrated something important about warfare. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from destruction, but from capture. Sinking the submarine would have been the easy, conventional response. One more U-boat removed from the battle. One more tally mark for the American Navy. But by taking the risk to capture her intact, Gallery and his men gained something far more valuable. They gained intelligence that helped win the war. They gained a technological windfall that improved American submarine design. And they gained a piece of history that has educated millions of people about an important chapter in human history. The story also reminds us that war is fought by individuals making split-second decisions under incredible pressure. Oberleutnant Lange deciding to surface rather than dive and doom his crew. Lieutenant David deciding to jump onto that submarine despite the dangers. The enlisted men who followed him down into that dark, flooded, a potentially explosive hell without hesitation. The American captain who saw an opportunity that no one thought possible and seized it. The German sailors who botched the scuttling just enough to give the Americans time to save the boat. Every one of these moments could have gone differently, and if they had, U-505 would be just another nameless submarine wreck on the bottom of the Atlantic. Instead, she is here, preserved, studied, visited by hundreds of thousands of people every year. She serves a purpose now that her builders never imagined, not as a weapon, but as a teacher, not as a tool of destruction, but as a reminder of what human beings are capable of. both in terms of the terrible things we do to each other in war and the extraordinary courage and ingenuity we display in surviving it. The German crew members who visited her in the 1990s understood this. They saw their old boat not as a symbol of Nazi Germany or of the lost war, but as a memorial to their shipmates who did not survive, to the men on both sides who fought and died in the Atlantic. They saw her as a bridge between past and present, a way to ensure that future generations would understand what happened and why it matters. Today, U-505 remains one of the most popular exhibits at the Museum of Science and Industry. People travel from around the world to see her. Veterans of submarine service, from many different countries and many different eras, come to pay their respects. They understand, in a way that civilians cannot, what it meant to serve aboard such a vessel. They understand the fear, the courage, the brotherhood, the terrible beauty of submarine warfare. The capture on June 4, 1944, lasted only a few hours, but its effects echoed through the rest of the war and beyond. The intelligence gained helped defeat Germany. The submarine herself became a symbol of American naval prowess and daring. The men who participated in the capture became heroes, though most of them would say they were just doing their jobs. And the German crew, who thought their boat and their story had sunk to the bottom of the Atlantic, lived long enough to see her again, and to know that their sacrifice and suffering had not been forgotten. This is the story of U-505, the German submarine that fought one last battle in the Atlantic Ocean and lost, but in losing became part of something larger than war. She is a piece of history, a classroom, a memorial, and a reminder that even in the darkest times, courage and ingenuity can create something positive from destruction.